G'day friends, family, fellow patriots. Lord Stompy here in Adelaide, South Australia. Welcome. So, the age of liberalism is nearly over. That is plain to see. The writing is on the wall. Now, in a Putin speech several years ago, he actually directly said the age of liberalism is nearly over. Now, whether you like Putin or not, he is one of the most intelligent and influential leaders that we currently have in the world at this point in time. So why would the great Russian leader Putin be saying this? In a recent article that quoted heavily from the ADL, the ADL actually said that white nationalism is rising rapidly and a new type of white nationalism is emerging. More and more high IQ middle class whites are becoming far right nationalists, and this is a new trend. The white nationalists of the past, for the most part, tended to be working class and lower IQ. Now, there was a key question here that the ADL deliberately didn't ask. And the intelligent question any sensible person would ask is, why are more and more middle class, high IQ whites becoming far-right nationalists? But it doesn't stop here. A recent political survey in UK found that approximately 50% of young people under the age of 30 wanted to live under some form of dictatorship. They literally want to live under a dictatorship of their choice. And whether it's Islamic, fascist, or even communist, that was up for grabs. But 50% of young people now are so disillusioned with post-World War II liberal democracy that we've had for the generations from the end of World War II. They're so disillusioned with the current system that they would prefer to live under a dictatorship. So that's a massive failure from the liberal democracy that supposedly represents the best system that mankind can possibly live under. Right? And this failing isn't ideological, it's actually systemic. And you only have to walk around the average Western country, the average Western city, to see the failure is now everywhere. The failure of the system is now playing out before our eyes on the streets. So how is it that liberal democracy, which has touted itself as being the supreme and the morally supreme, the intellectually supreme, the most humanitarian political system that we could possibly have, how is it that the younger generations now are so fed up with it that they literally want to throw it in the bin, that they want to trample it underfoot? This is an incredible turnaround. As a guy who's somewhat older, I grew up in the age when liberalism was a total powerhouse. It looked like it was going to triumph and conquer, and somehow it's just sputtered out into a disappointing mass of absolute confusion and just totally dissociative, unworkable system at this point in time. It is splintering before our eyes as we speak. So we have to go right back to the roots of democracy here to start getting a grip on this. And essentially, in its purest form, democracy is mob rule. So that just means the largest mass of people, whether they're right or wrong, whether they're stupid or clever. It doesn't matter about the personal nature of the mass of people. It doesn't matter about their particular attributes. Just the largest mass of people ends up ruling. And to a large degree, in our liberal democracies, that's what we've had since the end of World War II. So here in Australia, the Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, he was the Prime Minister who ended the White Australia policy. He was elected in 1972. He was the first left-wing ultra-progressive leader to actually take the reins of Australia. And even unto this day, he's a massive favourite of the older liberals here in Australia. The liberal boomers who were alive during Gough Whitlam's term, most of them have these very fond memories. And they tell me of all these great changes that he ushered in. So the moment he got in, suddenly funding towards the progressive arts was massively increased. The progressive arts were encouraged everywhere. The school systems were overhauled from a more old-fashioned empirical system to a much more progressive modern system. Schools used to have chaplains. In the old system, there was a Christian chaplain in every school, and the chaplain was there to be a spiritual guide to the children. And the majority of schools, they fired the chaplains, they removed them. They brought in social workers. Now, a social worker is somebody employed by the government. So, on the surface of it, a lot of Gough Whitlam's changes for the older liberals in Australia at that time, this seemed like very exciting, and that Gough Whitlam was ushering in this age of progression and freedom. But what he was actually doing was when the chaplains were in the schools, that was, chaplains weren't under the jurisdiction of the government. They were under the jurisdiction of the particular church that they served under. So they replaced independent men of God with government employees. Likewise with our arts. Before Gough Whitlam, our arts, there wasn't much government funding on the arts. So as an artist, you actually had to make art that appealed to enough people that you could make a living. Right? And so once Gough Whitlam came in, he came in with a progressive agenda, and the progressives in government began splurging on the arts. And this progressive splurging on the arts has not let up. It's still going on today. The governments all over the Western world will spend big dollars to prop up the progressive arts. So what you saw with this government funding was essentially now this new wave of progressive artists. It basically was making its living from the government. So they owed their allegiance to the government. So this was a very clever transfer of power, where the progressive state to the average person, the progressive nanny state, it looked like it was a very friendly-faced entity. It was providing all this benevolence and largesse to all the progressive people. And naturally this brought on a wave of enthusiasm and excitement for the government and the progressive policies that the government was pushing through. Now, it's really interesting because the Gough Whitlam campaign, I was told about this by a boomer, and I found it on YouTube. The Gough Whitlam election campaign that was on TV. Its theme was "It's Time," and so you had this TV commercial, and there was this incredibly androgynous hippie singer. You weren't sure if it was a man or a woman. It looked sort of more like a woman, but a very butch woman. And this woman was singing, "It's time, it's time," and there wasn't much other words than that. But as the advertising jingle continued, more and more progressive people on this stage began to be lit up with floodlights, and they were all just singing, "It's time." And it was this very euphoric song. And the whole point of this campaign was that no political policies were outlined. There was no intelligence behind this campaign. It was just merely the campaign merely showed this wave of massive progressive liberal enthusiasm and hysteria. And essentially, that advertising jingle encapsulates democracy. That's the mob rule. So it doesn't matter if the mob is right or wrong. It doesn't matter if the mob of people have a clear understanding of political processes or historical processes. None of that matters. The only thing matters in democracy is that you have the largest number of people. And as I just described from the Gough Whitlam progressive political agenda, it was really easy for the Gough Whitlam government to bribe the progressive people with taxpayer money and taxpayer-funded progressive gimmicks, right? It was very easy to get them on board and just get this large mass of progressive people to roll on behind whatever political agendas that the government pushed through. So this essentially is the nature of liberal democracy that we live under today. And what we've seen ever since the time of Gough Whitlam is just this continuation of that same liberal progressive cycle, where essentially the very far left progressive policies get really heavily pushed, really heavily funded. The propaganda, not just from the government, but from the corporations and from the education system, from every angle, from Hollywood, from everywhere. Every angle, we've had the far left progressive agenda just being pushed from on high down upon the masses. And the masses who have been essentially, ever since Gough Whitlam's time, have been basically very besotted. In general, the greatest number of people in the West have been very besotted with all these progressive left-wing policies. And so it's essentially, there's been this closed loop cycle for generations now in the West, where the progressive elites fund and promote all these progressive agendas. And this keeps the great mass, the democratic mass of people, on board with all the progressive policies that the leaders pushed. So it's no surprise that Gough Whitlam was the first Prime Minister in Australia. He was the guy who basically ended the White Australia policy and started the open borders policies that have now ruined all of our Western nations. This way of liberal progressive thinking, the political policies, the idea that every race and nation on the world can live together in Western lands in complete unity and harmony, and that somehow this process would actually make our Western nations even greater and more wonderful to live in. This is a key idea. This is a key belief that has fueled liberal democracy ever since the late 60s, and it's not stopped. So essentially, these policies now have turned out to be an utter disaster, and they're getting worse all the time. And young people are actually seeing the writing on the wall. As I said at the start of this chat, that people will vote with their feet. At the end of the day, when push comes to shove, when common sense, practical reality starts to bite, most sensible people will vote with their feet. So we're at a very interesting point in history here, in the history of the West, where essentially the older generations, the boomers, and even to a fair degree my generation, the Generation X guys, we all grew up in the heyday of progressive democracy. We grew up in the golden era, and I must admit, when I was young, it was pretty good. The 1980s were pretty good. As the 1990s really began to kick in, it began to go sour, and I myself did notice that. But the thing you're seeing here is a lot of the older generations now, they're still stuck in the loop. They're still stuck in the cycle that they grew up in. And they're still stuck with the same idealism and the same ideology. Now, the interesting thing here is the baby boomer generation are the most affluent generation in the history of the West. And they also have a very, very large population. They tended not to breed much, and neither did my Generation X generation. So we don't have very many children. We've actually, in every Western nation, our populations have been decreasing for decades. So the thing is the older generations still hold the political balance of power, and they're still living besotted and utterly smitten by this false idealism that this liberal boomer progressive democracy is the greatest system to have ever existed, even though it's completely destroyed the West. And all the evidence now is before our eyes. So what you're seeing now is new battle lines are emerging where the younger generation are saying to hell with this crappy progressive democratic system that we've been burdened with. It's now become an absolute burden on the younger generations. It's become something that stinks. It's an utter failure. Young people now can see the writing on the wall that they don't have a future in their own Western lands. And a massive part of this is the progressive policies that have been pushed for generations here in the West, while the older generations are still basically living off the fumes of their glory years. They're still holding the purse strings of the nation. They're living very, very comfortably. Most of them have very comfortable superannuation packages. They're all able to buy houses when housing prices were super cheap. and a single income family could literally save up and buy a house within 10 to 15 years. So essentially, the Western dream of just working hard and owning your own property, and basically when you own your own property, you have a sense of freedom because you own a small patch of land. All that's gone up in smoke. It's disappeared. And the main culprit has been all these liberal policies in the West. Now, of course, I've mentioned this time and time again on my channel. The whole race mixing open borders thing, which was touted as this idealistic policy that was going to solve racism forever. It is now backfiring more and more. The immigrants that are coming into our nations are just, for the most part, the very large majority are just wage slaves. They're just here to undermine our conditions and markets, make as much money as they can. A large percentage of them are sending our money out of our nation to their families back home. They're a massive burden on our health systems. Our welfare systems are now struggling to cope with the influx of foreigners. So what started out as progressive philanthropy and humanitarianism, this idea that, we should be helping the less fortunate people in the world. Well, now our nations are being flooded with these less fortunate people by the tens of millions, and they're just devouring our nations from under our feet. So this is democracy. This, at the heart and soul, this is democracy. Whoever has the largest mass of people is going to be the democratic winner. And it's going to be a very interesting future, because within 20 to 40 years, in every Western land now, European folks are going to be a minority. Now, this isn't scary to the boomers, because in the next 10 years, most of them will be dead. So they don't have any stake in their own future. But the children, the European children, can see that they're not going to be able to have any democratic power within their own countries. This is the nature of democracy. Here in Australia, in the next 20 years, the majority population is going to be Chinese and Indian. So when the Chinese and Indians have a greater number of people of us, it will be mob rule from those people. The Chinese and Indians are going to push all the policies that benefit their people. So it doesn't matter what people say or do. As soon as the foreign imports get the largest number of people, then the age of liberal boomer progressive democracy will be over. It will be dead. There will be the law of the jungle, which is essentially what democracy is if you let it get to that point. If you allow your civilization to devolve, which the progressive liberal boomers and Generation X people have allowed. They've allowed this to happen on their watch. So yes, my generation is very guilty of this too. What you are seeing here is that then if you live under democracy, you will revert to the law of the jungle. Just whichever mob is the loudest, the strongest, the brashest, the most aggressive, the most vociferous, will have the leadership roles. So this is going to be a very interesting time coming up. Within the next 20 years, we're going to have the Indians and Chinese will be replacing the police force. They'll be replacing the white people in the armies. What is going to happen when these imported people have the political power over the nation, and they have the control of the police forces on the street, and they have control of our armies? Now, I've already seen with my own eyes that these foreign imports have the foreign imports in the Australian Armed Forces have no loyalty to white Australia. The people who built and founded this country, they have no loyalty to us. So last year, on the Anzac Day dawn service, now this is a very important military event. It's a memorial day when we remember the sacrifice of all the great fighting men and women who made great sacrifices to defend our nation. So on this commemoration day, it's traditional that very many Australians get up at dawn. We go to a military service in honour of our veterans, and then we start drinking very early in the day, and the various ceremonial events happen throughout the day. So I went to the last Anzac Day, and that was in Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth is an area where there is an Air Force base, and quite often around the suburb of Elizabeth, I've seen the Air Force personnel in their military uniforms walking around. Now, I've seen a huge number of these people. Now, at least half of these people in military uniform are foreign imports. They're Asiatic, or they're Indian, or they're some of them are Arabic. So only about 50% of our Air Force personnel in the Elizabeth area are white. Now, when we had our Anzac Day commemoration in Elizabeth, like right next door to the Air Force base, I noticed that the crowd, it was about 500 white Australians and foreign imports that turned up to commemorate our gallant servicemen and our veterans and our fallen heroes. I literally saw in a crowd of 500 white Australians, 2 Indians. They were the only foreigners that turned up. So there's no respect in the armed forces for our own Australian heritage, our customs, and our culture. This is already happening on the ground now as I speak. The foreign imports who are now serving under the Australian flag don't give a damn about the Australian people, our Australian heritage, or our Australian values, anything. They don't care about white people, right? Essentially now they're just imported mercenaries who are just serving for a paycheck. So this is what liberal democracy is now devolving into. So we've got a lot of the older generation, and ideologically they would find a lot of fault with my views as a white nationalist, as essentially the older generation are still clinging to this idealized view of an Australia that once existed and no longer exists anymore. They're still clinging to an outdated, idealized view of progressive democratic values that are literally dying before our eyes. And these people can't understand why a guy like myself or millions of other European people are now absolutely turning away from progressive liberal values. And it's really interesting because these people living on the fumes of the past, on the long gone glory years of progressive liberal democracy, they're fighting a losing battle. They're dying off really quickly now, and it's only a matter of time before the age of liberalism will be over. So it's going to be replaced by something